All right. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's workshop all about Humanities DC's Oral History Interviewing Workshop. My name is Hilary Steen. We'll do some more intros later today, but I wanted to welcome you all to today's session. As you can see, this meeting is being recorded, so the slides and the presentation will be sent out via email to everyone shortly, and it will be put on the website as well. If you would like captions during this conversation, if you go to the bottom of your Zoom screen and click on the ellipses, you should be able to access captions that way. This is going to be a fairly long presentation. We have an hour and a half on the clock, but again, if you have to leave early for whatever reason, we will still send you the slides. If you have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to just interrupt us or use the chat feature if you want to type anything in. There will also be some Q&A sections built in as well. So let's get started. All right. So with how today's presentation will go, we'll start off with an introduction to Humanities DC and what we do, and then what is oral history. Then we will talk about the DC Oral History Collaborative, talk about this particular grant opportunity, provide some examples. We have a special guest speaker who will talk about her own project. We'll do some room introductions, then go into specifics about the grant itself, application questions, and close out with the review process. So again, my name is Hilary Steen. I'm one of the community grants managers at Humanities DC, and I oversee certain grant portfolios, including this one for oral history interviewing, and I will be your main point of contact for questions about this grant. But I'm also joined by some of my colleagues. So Jasper, if you can introduce yourself, please.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jasper Collier, and I'm the manager for the DC Oral History Collaborative program at Humanities DC.
Great. And Leah?
Hi, everyone. I am the other community grants manager at Humanities DC. Thanks for being here.
And Loy.
Hi, all. I'm Loy Namar, Director of Grant Making and Programs. Nice to see you all.
Great. So the four of us are your community grants team. And throughout the whole application process, Leah and I are your best points of contact if you have general questions about this whole process as well.
So, Humanities DC, for those of you who are not aware, we'll give you a brief introduction to who we are and what we do. We are DC's Humanities Council. So we are one of 56 state humanities councils across the nation, and we represent DC. We've been around for over 40 years, and our goal is to serve as a convener and documenter and supporter of DC public humanities projects. And we do this in a couple different ways. We have our own curated public programs, and that includes our community journalism program, which is a program that we just had open to encourage folks to apply to be community journalists. That's a 10-week program where community members can apply to be to write community stories that are published in local local outlets and get some training from local journalists. And then we also have our monthly culture series, several events coming up. That's a program that engages panelists and curators around DC to tell different stories about the work that they're doing. We have one coming up about comedy east of the river that should be really interesting. We have the DC Oral History Collaborative, which we'll learn more about as we go because it's key to this grant program. And then we have fellowships, both here in our office and just generally around the city. So those are our own curated public programs, but then we also offer grants, and those are to kind of support the general humanities community outside of Humanities DC. So this year we expect to make about $900,000 in grants to 50 plus grantees across all 8 wards of the city. And for the oral history interviewing grant, that should be about 10 grantees. And all of this funding comes through the DC government and through the Commission on the Arts and Humanities. And yeah, we're excited to make our grants this year. So in 2026, we have 6 grant opportunities that we plan to offer, that we will offer. So currently we have 3 open: the Community Culture and Heritage Grant, the Visions Grant, and then the Oral History Interviewing Grant, which we'll be talking about today. If you want information on any of these other grants, you can go to our website. That's linked below. And all of the details around our grant opportunities are available there. We will have a second cycle of grant opportunities that opens March 3rd. And that will include 2 additional DC Oral History Collaborative grants, the Beyond the Archives grant and Continuing Oral History Projects grant. And then we also offer a general operating support grant to humanities nonprofits. So take a look at our website if you want more information on all of these. Today, we're really just focusing on oral history interviewing, but we offer lots of different grants. Okay, and so while we're talking about the Humanities Council and Humanities DC, I wanted to ask you all if you could give some thoughts on what are the humanities? We have some descriptions here, but does anybody have any thoughts on how you would define the humanities? Feel free to unmute yourself if you're feeling brave, or drop it in the chat.
I guess I would say that I see it as something that study that encourages knowledge of like each other, other people.
Yeah, I like that. Study of knowledge that encourage us to know each other and other people. Yes, human is the first part of the word humanities. And we definitely emphasize at Humanities DC that shared understanding, cross-cultural understanding, cross-neighborhood understanding, etc. Any other thoughts? Anyone wants to share? So one broad way to think about it is human stories that allow us to navigate complexities of what's going on, whether we're trying to understand the past, we're trying to understand the present, or the future. And there are different humanities disciplines that kind of fall within that help kind of serve as frameworks to understand that. And so to help understand our past, we think about history, anthropology, archaeology. To understand our current public expression of our story and our experience, we may do that through literature, language, and art history or theory or criticism. And then understanding the meaning of our story and who we are through ethics, philosophy, comparative religion, and the law. We use the National Endowment for Humanities definition of the humanities. And when we share out this presentation, you can click on these links to kind of get more details.
And so oral history is one of the key tools of the humanities. So oral history interviewing is a particular kind of interviewing that asks about people's life story. So it is about how someone's life might intersect with historical events, and it adds perspective to the historical record. So instead of having a narrow series of questions like what you might find in journalism, oral history takes a really broad life story approach to historical events. And really, because oral history relies on memory, it captures recollections about the past that are filtered through the lens of a changing personal and social context. And like I said, oral histories are major tools that we have within the humanities. And you, as you're thinking about your own project perhaps, or about your own experience with oral history, you can interview people about non-humanities topics, about humanities topics. There's a wide variety of angles you can take with this kind of tool. And it's a really important tool to have. So oral history is a way that culture and values are shared to strengthen a community and inform new generations over time. It it produces historical documents for future generations so everyone can better understand lived experiences of history. It allows us to deepen and complicate the written record of history. It allows us to understand experiences that produce perspectives different from one's own. And it is really all about the art of relationships as well, since it is a relationship between the person doing the interview and the person who is getting interviewed. And on the screen, the two photos here are photos from an event that we did 2 years ago now called Stories in Motion. So Humanities DC still regularly goes around the city to do pop-up oral history booths. And so these are just two photos of a recent one that we did. And so I'm going to share a video about the importance of oral history in DC specifically.
I'm a native Washingtonian. I'm from Southeast DC. I model, I dance, I act.
I am an archaeologist.
I am a unique, interesting person.
There's a lot of stereotypes about DC that are thrown around.
You know, that's just a place where our government is.
To where politics reigns supreme.
But it's actually community and home to a lot of people.
It's much more diverse neighborhoods and historic neighborhoods that people don't really know about.
So we have to give the narrative, the experiences.
And through oral histories, I really want to highlight these contributions that people don't typically know or aren't necessarily written about in historical records.
It's so easy to just feel like your group is not important if all you learn about is what this person did, what Christopher Columbus did.
There's a lot of resilience that goes into being able to survive those circumstances and still come out on the other side and say, we can be better.
So just to sit down and talk to someone and give them the opportunity to just to tell their life narrative is a very special thing. It's almost like your imagination is ignited.
Just every time you think you know what someone's going to say, they're going to say something different, and that's fabulous.
Your story is important. Your history is important.
It's kind of like giving a gift to the next generation.
And when you share it, and you'd be so surprised and so shocked at how many people be like, oh my God, I went through that too.
When our children and grandchildren look to us for inspiration, they're going to learn from us and whatever it is that we tried to do.
So it's important to have these stories and to share these stories and to shout these stories and to sing these stories to inspire others not only to step up to the plate and feel good about themselves, but to share their stories as well.
So, we have talked about the DC Oral History Collaborative a few times in this presentation. If you have known about Humanities DC for a while, you've probably heard us talk about DCOHC. So now to explain what it actually is. So it is a partnership we have with the DC Public Library, and it's been around for, well, almost 10 years at this point. And DCOHC provides training, grant making, and conducts public projects all about the art and science around oral history interviewing in our city. And so in 2026, we have 3 grant opportunities that fall under the DCOHC umbrella: oral history interviewing right now. And then, like Leah mentioned earlier, in cycle 2, there's also Beyond the Archives and continuing oral history projects. So right now we have the Oral History Interviewing Grant. And so this provides funding for projects that explore DC life, history, and culture through interviews with the people who have lived it. So this funding allows people to conduct and archive oral history interviews. This grant is open to individuals who live in DC, also informal community groups, and 501c3 nonprofit organizations. So if you are an informal community group that might not have 501c3 status, then you would just have one person from that group be the primary grantee and the point of contact. But if you are an individual, if you're part of a 501c3, you're also eligible for this grant. And you can receive up to $8,000 to conduct and archive the interviews. However, you may also request an additional $5,000 specifically to translate transcripts into different languages. And we'll talk a little more about translation later in the presentation. This grant, it would take place between May 1st of 2026 through January 31st of 2027. So that means that during this time period, all grant funds must be spent, and ideally, the entire project will be done by the end of January. But I'll talk more about this timeline a little later in the presentation as well. This particular grant has a few different requirements, what we call deliverables, and these allow all interviews to be archived at the People's Archive at the DC Public Library. So all grantees must submit media files, so audio and or video files of the actual interviews, as well as transcripts, indexes, release forms, and metadata for each and every interview. And if what I just said makes zero sense, that's totally fine, because all grantees attend a 3-session in-person training workshop in early to mid-May at the beginning of the project period to learn how to conduct these interviews and how to actually work on the deliverables as well. And honestly, most applicants and grantees have never done an oral history project before receiving funds from this grant. So we are with you every step of the way, from the beginning to the very end, to help you with your project. Applications for this grant close on February 18th, so in a little over a month, just like all of the other Cycle 1 grants that are open. And at the bottom of the screen is the link to the RFP, and it's also available on our website. I won't talk too much about the RFP. If you have additional questions, I recommend attending or listening to one of our general info sessions because we talk about the RFP a little bit there. But I will show you briefly. Let's see if I can. Actually, I will show you the website later. So yeah, the RFP stands for Request for a Proposal, and it is about a 10 to 15 page long document that talks about what is involved with the grant. So it goes into detail about eligibility criteria, weighted review criteria, required reports, things like that, and it provides a little bit of a basis for how to start thinking about your potential grant. So I highly recommend, before you really dive into the actual application, that you look at this RFP. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a bit to invite our special guest to talk a little bit about her project. So Shilpi Malinowski received a grant from us back in 2024 that was called Mount Pleasant, the Rise and Fall of Cultural Community Centers. And Shilpi will talk a little bit about her experience with this grant and the topic at large. So Shilpi, whenever you are ready.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shilpi. Thank you for the introduction, Hillary. So I'm looking forward to talking a little bit about oral history interviewing with you all, and I definitely welcome any questions you might have. So first, just to explain who I am and how I got into oral history interviewing. So I was a journalist for many years, and I covered a couple topics, but one of them was local DC issues. So back in 2019, I actually started pursuing an article about life in DC's most gentrified area, which is the zip code 20001. And it was going to be about how I was wanting to find like somebody who moved in at every decade over the last 70 years and just try to get their impression of what it was like to live in this area. So I started interviewing for this article, and I just found myself taking these very long interviews, like hour and a half, really like a life history of your life as it relates to this neighborhood. And so the article kind of ballooned, and throughout capturing these interviews, I sort of realized that I didn't want to cut everything down for an article. I really wanted to capture the complexity of what people were saying. I didn't want to summarize it myself. So the article ended up becoming a book, which is this book, and it weaves these narrators' oral histories together. And after I did that project, I really developed an abiding interest in oral history as a method, how it differs from journalism. One of the things that one of the ways in which oral history differs is that all of my narrators had the opportunity to change their words before I published the piece. So I really liked that oral history was like broad enough to encompass like contradictions and complexity, and also that it gave the narrators back some power, and that I could kind of work with them. So anyways, I finished that project, and then I was looking at another Mount Pleasant kind of caught my eye, because Mount Pleasant is another neighborhood that has experienced a lot of demographic change over the years. And it's also a neighborhood that people love, like passionately love living in Mount Pleasant. And I noticed that it was a kind of served as an incubator for communities. So my first book, the theme of the book was who belongs here, kind of as it relates to individuals. So how do people experience a sense of belonging in a neighborhood that's changing? With Mount Pleasant, I sort of saw it as the second chapter of this Who Belongs Here series. And I wanted in particular to focus on communities. So I looked at communities like Mount Pleasant Village. It's a supportive community for elders to age in place. I looked at punk rock group houses. I looked at activist communities that supported Latin America and Latin Americans. I looked at white churches where the people in that church wanted to integrate, wanted to live in a minority neighborhood so that they could integrate very explicitly. So this was a project I had in mind when I was applying for my 2024 grant. And I was so honored to have gotten the support and to be able to work with Jasper and Hillary and everybody on the team. So I want to talk about the grant a little bit, some of the highlights for me of the grant process. One was having a cohort and just having a group to talk to about, all these different projects that we were working on and all the nitty-gritty of oral history. The other was I actually had an interest in doing the official work of oral history. So with my first book, I did use oral history as a method, but I didn't do all of the things that are involved with oral history. The interviews are not archived anywhere, for example. They just exist on my computer. So I was actually very interested in just seeing what the full process was like. So taking the interviews, doing a full transcript, archiving it at the library, having metadata recorded, doing an index. I found that very interesting and satisfying. What else? Using their story. These are all things that you will learn about. It's a wonderful platform for oral historians. And then one of the final questions that Hillary asked was how the grant enabled me to kind of expand the work. Well, I will say the grant, it's very legitimizing for a project to get a grant. It just gives you this like emotional support and financial support that makes the project, moves the project forward in a really real way. And so now at this point, I have all this material accumulated, and I was able in September to present it to the public, to like a non-history in a public forum at a talk for Creative Mornings DC, to share these stories that would be otherwise have been just like existed in people's minds or just in their private conversations, to kind of bring these stories out into the public. But I've been rambling, so I guess I'll stop there. I would love to take questions if anyone has questions about anything.
Shilpi, I wonder if you can talk to about how long it took you to do each interview, kind of from the scheduling phase and the research phase to the creation of the metadata and the transcripts and indexes.
Yes, it takes quite a while. So I would say, um, and that was also really interesting. So you have to keep a timesheet for this process. Whereas with my first project, it was all sort of like nebulous, you know? But I think finding someone to interview maybe takes a long amount of time because you never know when someone's going to emerge. And then the interview itself is the shortest thing. It's an hour and a half, you know, usually. And then after that, transcription, even with the help of AI, I would say transcription took maybe 4 or 5 hours to get a perfect transcript. Um, and then getting there, you know, you send it back for approvals. That takes another, you know, they maybe it'll take a week or so of waiting. And then indexing and metadata is another maybe 5 or 6 or 7 hours. Maybe each interview, I would say maybe 20 hours of hard work, but then weeks of waiting and connecting that also needs to be accounted for. I would love to hear if anybody has like a project idea they want to just throw out there or questions about interviewing, anything.
Yes, my name is Idris Abdullah. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you very well.
Okay. So you basically said it took you about 20 hours per interview. Am I correct?
To process it completely. I think so.
And in my particular or my projected project, the individuals have already been identified. There were a group of about 20 some odd children that were raised in the same block. And for whatever reasons, this was during the late 40s through the mid 60s. Their academic performance was, I mean, just literally outstanding. It was like a 50% college graduation rate, 3 PhDs.
Wow.
None of the parents were college graduates, and everyone were basically children, were people of color. And I thought it would be significant not only to record or document their experiences, but also to provide us with some data that could possibly help with, you know, current academic achievement.
Yeah, that sounds like a
so we have a defined pool of people.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the million-dollar question is, should I still expect about 20 hours, you know, given that I'm not going to have to search these people down, so to speak. I know them. I grew up with them.
Yeah.
But bottom line is just kind of safe to say 20 hours per interview makes sense. And what do you think? There are 20 some odd kids, you know, we've lost some through, you know, through death and through moving away. So really the available pool is close to about maybe 12.
Yeah.
And so I'm planning to interview 4 to 6.
Mm-hmm.
Does that seem to you like a reasonable sample from an available pool of say 12 to 14 people?
Yeah, I'll answer both those questions. I think it sounds like an amazing project and that a very reasonable number of interviews. And I do think the 20 hours, it just takes time. All of the processing of the interview, it does take time. You know, I think because it goes into the library for this project, the People's Archive, the transcript needs to be really perfect. And it just takes, you know, it takes a certain amount of time to make sure everything is ready to be put in a permanent archive.
As part of my work with UDC and some other academic work I was doing, I'm gonna be honest, I really did not understand, or I still don't fully understand, you know, the complexity of some of these interviews. We were interviewing custodial staff, or you know, custodial cafeteria staff in terms of academic performance and retention of low to moderate income, students in a university environment. And, interviewing these custodians and cafeteria workers, I mean, was enlightening. But again, I had no concept of the amount of time that it would take. And a lot of these AI technologies for transcripts, they sound good on paper, but like you say, it takes time getting a perfect transcript. So I want to thank you for for your comments. At least it's an affirmation that some of my apprehensions or some of my experiences were indeed valid.
Good luck.
Yes.
Gerald, I see you raise your hand.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I wasn't clear to me, did you interview each person one time or multiple times?
For the Mount Pleasant project, I interviewed them once. We did, I connected with them and then figured out if they were interested, did a very short kind of make sure we're both on the same page as to what we're going to talk about. And then I interviewed them one time. And then there's a processing of the interview. And then at the end, I did give everybody their interview transcript and audio file so that they could approve it before we turned it in.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
We have time for maybe like one more question for Shilpi.
I have a question. I couldn't find my hand to raise, so forgive me for not raising my hand. But I also have a journalism background, and one thing I'm trying to determine is when to engage oral history and, when a project is a journalism project and when it is an oral history project. The reason I say that is I'm very interested in exploring the stories of the 300,000 African American women who were fired in 2 months, many of them in the Washington area from the federal government. And the whole issue of working in Washington as a form of culture, because what we do in DC, even in compared to other cities, they've compared DC to New York, and they found people in DC work more and enjoy life less. Like we don't do recreational things. We work. And so this whole idea of working as a culture of Washington and exploring the experiences of these women working and what the loss of that work really meant. We know, for example, when Woodrow Wilson changed working in the federal government when he was president, it had a dramatic effect on Washingtonians. People are more mobile now, though. So some of the people working in DC, they may not live in DC. And that's why I'm wondering how to kind of slice this, parse it so that it fits into a lens that the Humanities Council would be interested in, and whether I should do part of my project as an oral history project to look at the women in DC and how it affects their lives in DC. But of course, there's also a much larger expanse of people who are affected. So I don't know whether that makes any sense, but
I think it does make sense. I think it can be you can have two separate thought processes. One is like collecting the interviews, but then the second one is what are you going to do with it later? And maybe it would help to just focus on the collecting part first. And then, because the later project can be a work of journalism.
Interesting. Okay, that makes sense. And then would all of these people from the Humanities Council perspective have to live in DC, or could they, or or do you look at working in DC as a form of culture?
I think that's a question for Hillary or Jasper.
Yeah, so they do not have to necessarily live in DC today.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Well, just in the interest of time, I think it's time to continue with the presentation. But Shilpi, thank you so much for sharing your insight and your expertise with everyone. Any, I guess, final thoughts before we continue?
No final thoughts, just that, I'm really grateful the city has this program. I think oral history is a wonderful way to really capture, a human experience of how people are experiencing life in the city. And good luck to everybody.
Great. Right. I will share my screen again and we will continue. All right. So one key part of the application and of your project is something called the interest area. So some of you might have already taken a look at the application. You might have come across this question. And the interest area is really the core of what a DCOHC project is. So it is a research question or a topic that you hope to explore through the interviews that you conduct. And so interest areas go beyond quote unquote just an interest in a historical topic. It goes into more detail. So as you are thinking about your project, I also recommend that you think of it in terms of this interest area. So you can think about the previous research that has already been done on the topic and perhaps approach the interest area as a way to fill in gaps of understanding, or perhaps explore existing knowledge from a new angle, or even perhaps reassess history. So what do you determine to be missing in the historical record? And how can people's memories of an event or a time period add to our understanding of it? So all of that is really what is at the core of your actual project. So I wanted to provide two examples, in addition to what Shilpi mentioned about, this is one example of a current grantee, Christ House, and their project is called Healing and Hope, the Christ House Oral History Project. I'm not going to go into everything that's written here, and apologies for the small text, but I just wanted to read aloud part of what they wrote and why it's such a strong interest area. So this oral history project will explore the profound impact of Christ House over the past 40 years through the lived experiences of those who built, sustained, and were transformed by its work. So they will interview the founders, but also beyond the founders, they will explore the experiences of former patients, staff, volunteers, and community partners. Their perspectives will illustrate how Christ House not only provided medical care, but also restored dignity, inspired service, and influenced broader efforts to make healthcare more equitable. Unlike written reports or statistical analyses, oral history provides space for individuals to share their journeys in their own words, preserving emotion, perspective, and personal insight. And it's particularly important for marginalized voices, such as those who have experienced homelessness, ensuring that their stories are affirmed and dignified rather than reduced to impersonal data points. So with this particular example, it is specific. So it is about who Christ House would like to interview, over how long of a time period, so over the past 40 years. And they also talk about why oral history is so important for this particular topic as well. So that's one example. Another example, again, apologies for the small text. This is from another current grantee, Kai Walther, and their project is called Unsanctioned: Gay Cruising and Culture in Washington, D.C. So again, I'll read aloud some of the bold points. I will explore how and why gay men took part in the unsanctioned activity of cruising, with its potential for dangerous or violent encounters, legal consequences, and spread of sexually transmitted infections, including HIV, as well as possible intimate relationships, social encounters, and sexual freedom. This project will focus on the years between 1970 and 2000. Gay men in the US have been cruising long before 1970, but I am particularly interested in cruising during this period of heightened visibility, tragedies, and progress for gay people. Oral histories diversify the historical sources base by including perspectives of those whom the established LGBT organizations, movements, and narratives did or could not represent. For a topic as potentially sensitive or controversial as cruising, it is important to hear from the people who actually engaged in the practice. They are the experts, and it is only through recording their stories the way they want to tell them that this history will be documented. So this is another wonderful example of an interest area because Kai was specific about who they wanted to interview, gay men who were involved in this community between 1970 and 2000, and also talked about the importance of why these stories deserve to be told and what kind of gap in the research this history is trying to fulfill. So I want to stop sharing my screen again to invite people on the Zoom screen to introduce themselves a little bit. I know that a few have already introduced themselves. Just in the context of time, I think we have time for maybe 2 people to introduce themselves. Or you're more than welcome to type your intros into the chat. And I encourage you all, as you introduce yourself, to think of it like you would an interest area. So what is your topic? Are you thinking about a time period, who you want to interview, and why you think that oral history is the most important or the best format for this topic? So again, I think 2 people we have time for, if anyone wants to be brave.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Malik Wilson. I'm a faculty fellow at the University of Maryland and work in oral histories in the School of Sociology. And 2 years ago, we did an oral history project where we interviewed older African Americans, those who can remember the transition from segregation to integration, and that we sort of saw as the last witnesses of a kind of civilization that had preserved African American life and culture, oftentimes without help and oftentimes with direct resistance. But nevertheless, what we found is that people spoke in glowing terms and memories of this bygone world. And we interviewed about 12 people from DC. And so my interest is in furthering this program and finding older African Americans in Washington, DC, who can speak about this transition and to really get these stories down while they're still here to be told.
Great, thank you. Maybe one more person?
Yeah, I'd like to throw something out. I'm an ANC commissioner. One of the questions that's been perplexing me about the organization is what people thought they were doing when they created it. And since that was in 1967, a lot of the people who were actively involved are need to be talked with now or never. And so I feel some sense of urgency about identifying which of those people are still around and seeing what it is they had in mind. Whether my hypothesis is it was an unintended good consequence or whether someone really planned how this was going to work out. I know the political history of it, but I don't know what people were thinking about at the time.
Great, thank you. So if anyone else would like to introduce themselves, you're more than welcome to plop it in the chat for us all to read what you're thinking. But I'm going to continue with the presentation. Right. So there are, as you might have already seen in the RFP, there are a few grant requirements. Talked a little bit about deliverables, but now we'll go into more detail about what's involved. So all grantees must attend that training workshop that happens at the beginning/middle of May. It's in person, it's at the MLK Library in downtown DC in the evening, and it is ideal to have the main interviewer attend all 3 of those trainings. Other team members are also more than welcome to join, but it is best if that main person is able to attend all 3 of them. Another requirement is that you interview at least 5 people over the full project period. And there is also one of the required reports is the interim report, which will be due on September 15th. And this is a pretty brief report that is about, you would explain how the funds have been spent so far and any brief overview of the progress to date. And before that deadline, you would have a one-on-one conversation with me and Jasper, the senior manager of DCOHC, to talk through your project, how things are going, as well as any questions that you have. And I'm going over a few grants administrative info, and more information about all of this will also be provided at the beginning of the project period during the workshop. So just FYI. And then the deliverables, a little more detail about what those are. So like I mentioned, this requires a media file, so audio and or video files of you actually conducting the interviews, transcripts, which would be the word-by-word text of the full interview, indexes, which are summaries of different segments of the interview, metadata, which goes into detail about where and when the interview happened, key names, how long it was, things like that, as well as release forms. Because the narrator keeps the non-exclusive right to use these interviews however they deem appropriate, but it also assigns copyright of the interviews to DCPL in order for them to be able to put the interviews into the People's Archive. All of those deliverables are due on March 3rd of 2027, which is 30 days after the end of the grant period. We do highly encourage people to actually finish all these deliverables by late January, but yes, they are technically due by early March. All of these deliverables are prepared in a platform called Their Story, which just allows everything to be kept in a single platform, and all grantees will receive training on how Their Story works, how to upload everything. If you do any virtual interviews, you can actually do those interviews directly in Their Story. It's a wonderful platform. And again, we would provide training every step of the way for that. All interviews will be publicly available. So if you are thinking about your project and it might be a little more of a controversial topic, you can already imagine people wouldn't want their interview to be publicly available. Just talk to us and we can figure something out. But typically, all interviews that you conduct, once they are in the DC Public Library, they will be publicly available. Also on March 3rd is the final report for this grant, and this report will include a full explanation of funds that have been spent. You would provide documentation of all expenditures, so this includes receipts, invoices, timesheets, things like that. And it also is a project evaluation as well.
Okay, so once you've completed this and put the deliverables into their story, we send these to DCPL, the DC Public Library. All of those things that we require, the metadata, the indexing, the transcripts, as Hillary said, all of that is because that is how the archive is built, and that's what DCPL requires. So they will do quality control, they'll do spell check, they'll do formatting, and they'll make sure that everything looks right. And once it is, then they import everything to the People's Archive Digital Repository, or Dig DC. And if you've never been to Dig DC before, I highly encourage you to check it out. It is the DC Digital Archive at the public library, and you could, just drop in your neighborhood information, and you can see all kinds of cool pictures and oral histories. It's a really cool resource. And that's where all of the oral histories are housed, which is really cool because then they can be accessed at any time by anyone, and it's free and easy to find. So definitely check out Dig DC. So this grant covers many different things, but basically what it covers is anything related to the oral history collection. So that can fund salary and wages, that's for the narrators, for anybody who's working on the planning for the project. Honoraria and stipends, typically that's what you're paying your narrators, or when we say narrators, those are the folks who are being interviewed. So we recommend that all narrators are paid and in some form, and that they're compensated, and we encourage you to put that in your budget. You could be paying for consulting fees related to the project, recording equipment, as well as recording platforms. That said, all of those things, and transcription, but you can see the asterisks there, their story, which is the system that Shilpi mentioned and that Hillary mentioned, that's available to all grantees, and that does the initial transcription for you as well as the recording. So we highly recommend using that. You could use this grant to fund space rental, to house the interviews, to conduct the interviews, transportation for your narrators, translation. We do offer additional funds for translation if you're trying to translate your transcripts from another language into English. We typically prioritize that, just given that the archives require everything be put in English. This cannot fund anything that's not related to the project itself. So general operation for a nonprofit, rent or overhead, salaries that aren't related to this project, general office supplies, things like that are not eligible. Unfortunately, we can't fund any kind of food or beverage, though I know that many people use that to try to entice narrators. Unfortunately, those expenses cannot be included as part of this grant. This grant does not fund tuition or scholarships or any kind of re-granting. We cannot fund debt reduction. We cannot fund any government agencies, foreign or domestic. And this grant is not intended to fund any kind of interpretation or interpretive work that uses these oral histories. So if you want to do that, if you want to take the oral histories and produce an article, produce a film, anything like that, you would look at the Beyond the Archives grant. This is only intended for the collection, the archiving, and the documentation of these interviews. And so fiscal sponsorship, this is something that isn't required for this grant. As Hillary said, individuals can apply for this grant, but if you do wish to work with a fiscal sponsor, you can. We have a few different nonprofit organizations that we've worked with to serve as fiscal sponsors. So if you're interested or have questions, you can let us know. But fiscal sponsors essentially assume all financial and legal obligations of a particular grant. They are in charge of the application submission, the acceptance, and the maintaining of the funds and any kind of reports that are required. We say that no more than 10% of a given grant be paid as an administrative fee to a fiscal sponsor. So that would be something you'd want to talk to your fiscal sponsor about. And the eligibility requirements are the same as any other nonprofit. They need to be a DC-based 501c3 nonprofit if you're working with a fiscal sponsor. They would be the primary contact for the grant portal and submitting the application and all of that. So if you have questions about fiscal sponsorship as it relates to in this grant, just let us know.
So, Shilpi was talking about this earlier about the time commitment for this particular kind of project. And past grantees have indicated that it takes between 20 and 50 hours of work for each oral history interview, which includes the required trainings, research, scheduling interviews, which can take a long time, actually conducting the interviews, working on all of the deliverables, and working on the reports as well. So I'm saying all this, I don't want to intimidate any of you, but just being honest that this kind of project does require a lot of time. And so we highly recommend that before you submit your application, that you take a look at your own schedule to see if you can realistically do your project within the project period. And so a sample timeline, this is not absolutely required, obviously, but it is something that we recommend. So again, in May, you have those trainings. By July, we hope that you would recruit all of your narrators and then actually start doing the interviews in September. Also in September, that's when the interim report is due. And then in October, that's when you start working on the deliverables, the transcripts, the indexes. And we highly, highly recommend that all interviews are done by mid-November, so you would have time to close out the project on time, because the deliverables, like Shilpi mentioned earlier, does take a lot of time. So ideally, all interviews are done by mid-November. And so you would be able to submit all of the deliverables by January, and the final report would be due in March. Like I mentioned earlier, we provide extensive assistance throughout the entire project period, but at the end of the day, it is the grantee who actually needs to do the project themselves. So before I dive into more specifics about the actual application, are there any questions at this point? All right. Well, again, feel free throughout the presentation to type questions into the chat or interrupt us. So starting off with something called the weighted review criteria. So this criteria reflects what makes an application successful to the reviewers or the people who are actually looking at your application. The entire application obviously is important, but we do recommend that you keep this criteria in mind as you work through the application. And so these criteria break down the application into 4 major sections. So the first, which is worth 35% of your score, is about the project description. So this is what your project actually is. So this is where you would write about the interest area, as well as why oral history is the ideal tool for this topic. The second section, worth 25% of your score, is the contribution to DC history. So this is where you would note why your project is important to DC. It is totally fine if your research topic, your interest area is hyperlocal, but at the end of the day, all projects should provide important human context to the history of DC and its residents. The third section is community collaboration, worth 30% of your score. And this is the external element of your project. So perhaps you want to work with partners. This is where you would talk about how they will help strengthen your project. This is where you would note your recruitment plan for finding the narrators, so the people who you're interviewing, and why you chose to interview members of that particular community. If you're not connected to them already, how will you build those connections? And the final criterion is worth 10% of your score, which is capacity and personnel. So this is who is actually working on the project. So this is the project director, who's the person kind of in charge of the entire project. and they are leading the project forward. This is also where you would talk about other team members or collaborators if you would like. They're not required, but if you would like. And everyone's role in the project's planning, development, and or implementation is explained in this section as well. So those are the 4 criteria for the weighted review. So I'm going to switch to a different screen, but here is the grants portal instructions. This is available on our website, and this provides an overview of how to actually access the grants management system, about creating an account, what everything looks like, and how to actually end up applying as well. And we do ask that if you have submitted applications for funding in the past, that you continue using the same account from previous years. And if you have any questions about creating an account or the grants management system, please let us know. We would be happy to go over that. So this is our grants management system. What you all see on my screen is a little bit different from what you would see on your screen, but I wanted to show it from the back end because these are all of the possible sections that may pop up for you. Certain sections will appear depending on responses you provide earlier in the application. So not all of these sections will be applicable to you and your project, but I do want to go through them. But before I really dive into this, I want to bring you to our website where you can find more information about all of this. So humanitiesdc.org, our website. If you go to community grants and go down to grant opportunities, this lists all of the open grant opportunities right now. So when you go to down here, oral history interviewing, this has the RFP, which again is that it's a 10-page document. It goes into all of that information that we mentioned earlier. Also, a full PDF of all of the application questions in case you would like to take a look before you really dive into the grants portal. And we will also upload this recording to this section as well in the future. But I also recommend to just take a look at this webpage. It has additional resources on the side here as well. All right. So I'm not going to go into every single question here, but let us get started in the application. So under applicant information, this is where the applicant puts information about themselves. So an individual would be a single person who is applying, or the representative of the informal group, or the organization, that 501c3 nonprofit. And so this section just goes into some more detail about where the applicant is, how you learned about the grant, things like that. And then we also have a question around previous Humanities CC grant experience. This is a question that the reviewers do not see. This is just viewable by us on staff, and it just reminds us what your previous project was about, if you have received funding from us in the past, as well as your experience there as well. If you are going through a fiscal sponsor for this application, the fiscal sponsor is the one to actually submit the application, and they're the ones to sign it as well. So if you want to use a fiscal sponsor, that fiscal sponsor creates the account on our grants portal. They check off organization, and that's how you move through the application. And so if your fiscal sponsor or your 501c3 nonprofit is applying for this grant, this additional section pops up, and this is where you would put information like the mission statement, brief history of the organization, things like that. All organizations must be registered in DC, but if your organization was incorporated in a another state, you would upload your quote unquote foreign entity registration here. If you have any questions about this, definitely let us know. And then down here, if you're using a fiscal sponsor, this is where, you know, that fiscal sponsor would check off if they are sponsoring or not. But if you are an individual, so a single person who is applying for this grant, then this section pops up, the individual applicant information. And to be an individual applicant, the main requirement is that you are at least 18 years old and that you live in DC. So this is where you would upload proof of both your age and DC residency. And whatever you upload is not viewable to the reviewers as well. This is just viewable to us on staff. So don't worry about your private information going out there. Then this last section, for this section, I guess, is about the fiscal sponsor. So this is where the fiscal sponsor would note who or what they are actually sponsoring. And they would also upload this letter of confirmation, which illustrates that the fiscal sponsor understands what they're signing up for, basically. So the template is here that fiscal sponsors are allowed to use, but at the end of the day, the letter should include the name of both the fiscal sponsor and the applicant, the EIN, and that they sign off on that letter as well. So that's all the intro information. So the first big section, so this is project description, and this is worth 35% of the total score, like I mentioned earlier. So this is where you would put the project name, how much you would like, and then the interest area, which is what I was talking about earlier. And remember that the interest area should be both very clear and very specific about what you want your project to actually be. This is where you would check off humanities disciplines if your project would explore any of these major disciplines. Total estimated interviews, as a reminder, you need to interview at least 5. So you would just plot that number here. Reviewers would not see how many interviews you want to conduct. This is just for us on staff to make sure that you have at least 5 people in mind for this. And another question that reviewers do not see is the timeline. So this is where you would put the steps of your proposed project, which should include milestones, relevant dates, things like that. That shows how you imagine you can successfully do the project during the grant period. And this timeline is your best guess at the time of when you submit the application. So as a reminder, each interview would take between roughly 20 to 50 hours. So that's something to keep in mind as you're creating the timeline. And yeah, so this is something, again, that reviewers do not see. And we do that because after you move through the trainings as a grantee, you will have the opportunity to revise this timeline. We realize that many applicants have never done an oral history project before. So we definitely understand that once you go through the training, you'll have a better idea about what's involved. And so you would be able to redo the timeline if need be. But nevertheless, it is still required for the actual application. The next section is the contribution to DC history, which again is 25% of the total score. And this is where you would describe the importance of preserving these stories for the future and present, I suppose. It is, again, totally fine for your project to be hyper-local. We've had grantees and applicants focus on residents of a single apartment building. That is totally fine. You are also welcome to expand your project to all of DC, whatever makes sense. And here is kind of where you would describe what makes your project interesting, ultimately, and why are these stories important for DC residents. And I also want to point out, I know I'm kind of going quickly through the application, there are character limits for all of the text boxes. You do not have to use all of the space that's provided. It is totally fine if you don't, but you have a lot of space just in case you would like to write everything out as well. The next section is community collaboration, which again is 30% of your total score. And so you would start off by talking about the target audience. So what is the age range of that target audience, the race and ethnicity, etc. And then this is where you would talk about how your project will involve the community. And ideally, the potential narrators, so the people who you're interviewing, will do something beyond just providing their stories. So perhaps they can connect the project director to other narrators. Maybe they will help with general outreach. Maybe they will help figure out locations for where the interviews will take place, things like that. So it goes beyond just asking people for their stories, but they're actively involved. And also down here about community connection. So this is where the project director and or team members would note their connections to the involved community. So perhaps someone on the project team is part of the community itself, or if they're not, then this is where you would describe how you would actually build connections with someone. And we do ask if you could be thoughtful about recruitment plans for finding your narrators. So in this question here, community involvement and recruitment, that recruitment is one of the main parts of this question, obviously. So although you do not have to list individual people by name during the application stage of who you want to interview, you should still be thoughtful in where you hope to find the narrators for your project. And then down here is about translation enhancement. So like we've mentioned earlier, we do have a limited pool of funds for projects that would like to translate transcripts into different languages. The interviews can be conducted in any language that you would like. So this would be English and or a language other than English. For this translation enhancement, it is only to cover translating the transcripts. So one of the required deliverables for this. So if you want to translate other elements of the project, so perhaps like outreach materials, or if you want an interpreter at the interview, that is typically not covered by the translation enhancement funds. So you would find other sources of funding for that, or the quote unquote based funding that you would receive already for this grant. If you do have more questions about translation, we can definitely talk offline, because we prefer for these funds to be given to projects in which the interviews are conducted in a language other than English. Because like Leia mentioned earlier, the transcripts for archival purposes at the DC Public Library must be in English. So that's why we prioritize those particular projects. But again, the enhancement is available even if you want to conduct interviews in English, but would like it to be accessible to perhaps the Spanish-speaking community or the Mandarin-speaking community. That is available as well. And so based off of your response here, one of these two boxes will pop up. So if you are conducting your interviews in a language other than English, then you are basically automatically eligible to receive the $5,000 enhancement because of that language requirement for DCPL. But if you are conducting your interviews in a language other than English, but you would still like the enhancement, this section will pop up, and this is where you will explain a little bit more about how that translation will make the project more accessible to different communities as well. Then the next section is about capacity and personnel. So this is, again, 10% of the total score, and this focuses on who is actually working on the project. So again, the project director is the person who is actually leading the bulk of the project. So you would provide some contact information. This is not viewable to the reviewers. This is mostly just for us on staff. Project directors do not have to live in DC. And this is where the project director would talk about why they want to actually do the project and what role they will play in the actual project itself. And down here is where you would note additional team members as well. You don't necessarily need other people other than the project director to do this kind of project, but most projects do benefit from having other people involved, which would allow the project director to not have to do everything by themselves. It also might allow for more community buy-in, various things like that. So having team members or not will not influence your score for if you're chosen for funding. But if you are chosen for funding, having team members will probably be helpful, but again, not absolutely required. And then this is where you would put your familiarity with oral history interviewing. So this is if any of the team members, the project director, knows how to do oral history interviewing or not. This is another question that reviewers do not see. This is just for us on staff to see how familiar you are, basically. And this might help us with the training that everyone does at the beginning of the project period. So like I've mentioned earlier, it is totally fine if you've never done an oral history project before. You would just note that here. But if you do have experience, note that here as well. Again, reviewers don't see this. It doesn't have any sway over if you were chosen for funding. It's just important for us to know. And then this is the budget section. So this entire budget section is not viewable to reviewers. This is viewable to us on staff. And we are doing this because similar to the timeline that I talked about earlier, how people might not know when milestones might happen during the project, applicants might also not know how much to spend on different things. So after the training, all brand new grantees will be allowed to update their budgets if needed. But we do need this at the application stage as well, just so we on staff can have a good idea about what you're thinking at this point in time. And so in this column here, Humanities DC grant funds, this is where you would put where you would hope that the grant funds from us would go towards. And then this column here is for other sources of funding. If you have, it is not required to have other sources of funding, but if you do, you would plop them here. And so I will go down line by line here. So honoraria is essentially the stipend that is paid to narrators or community participants for their time and energy and their stories. Like Leia mentioned earlier, we do highly recommend that narrators do get paid, but it is not absolutely required. The next category is salaries and wages, and this is what will be paid to the project team members. So this might be the project director, it might be if other people are working on the interviews or the research, things like that, that's the salary. And so we differentiate honoraria and salary because, again, we think of honoraria more like stipends and salaries more for the labor of the project team members. But especially if you're an organization, feel free to kind of define for yourselves where you want to put personnel expenses. So if you have an all-volunteer organization, you feel a little uncomfortable saying that you're paying someone a salary, that's okay. You can plop all personnel into honoraria, that's totally fine. We just separate them out because it's helpful, but it's really up to you. Next section is supplies. So this is for all tangible items that you hope to buy, including microphones, paper, etc. Microphones is really like the biggest thing that's under supplies, but it's really like any physical item that you hope to buy with these funds. Next is translation enhancement. So again, you can receive up to $5,000. This is to translate transcripts. And then other is anything else that doesn't fit neatly into one of these other categories. And then down here is the budget narrative, which is where you would explain how all of the funds that you listed in this column will be used. We ask that you describe every single dollar amount that you put in the budget table. In this particular column, you need a dollar amount in every single cell, even if you don't plan to actually spend any funds in something. So if you perhaps are not going to request a translation enhancement, you have to put 0 in this cell here. So every single cell in this column must be filled out with 0 or a different number. But everything that does have a different number has to be described in the budget narrative here. We allow for both lump sums and calculations. It's up to you and what you prefer. Just make sure to describe everything, basically. And we find that the budget and budget narrative sections are things that people are especially concerned about, especially for individuals who maybe have never done something like this before. So I want to emphasize that budgets are plans. Like I said earlier, you are more than welcome to update your budget once you become a grantee, but just put as much information as you can at the time of the application submission. It is also optional to have a community shareback session. This is like a semi-private event that you can do for sharing your project with narrators, perhaps with their family members. It's not a big public event. It's just like, hey, I interviewed you last month. Let's talk about the interviews. That would be the shareback session. It's not required, but if you would like, you can have one. And I also realized that it is 1:26, so we will be going beyond 1:30. So if any of you do have to drop off at 1:30, totally fine. We will be, again, sharing these slides and the presentation with everyone later. So next section is about ADA compliance. This section will only pop up if you are applying on behalf of a 501c3 nonprofit that has 15 or more staff members. So this will ask about basically the organization's approach to ADA compliance. So this is about different accessibility plans, the physical accessibility of your office, accessibility around presenting activities like around communications, things like that. So again, this section will only pop up if your organization has 15 or more staff members. Then this is an optional section called the appendix. This is something that could support your application. So this might be resumes of other project team members. If you have any planning documents you created already, if you have narrators who are definitely on board, you can upload their letters of commitment here. And you're also welcome to respond to questions earlier in the application over video if you prefer. either way, this whole section is available. It's not required. Reviewers will see everything in this section. We do recommend that unless you are responding to a question via video, if you're providing like the resumes, the letters of commitment, things like that, to have all of that not necessarily be brand new information that the reviewers have not seen earlier in the application, but something that supports the application itself. We also recommend that for the appendix documents to try to keep it under like 20 pages or so. Reviewers will see this, but if you upload a very extensive number of documents, they might not be able to really absorb everything you write. So we do recommend below like 20-ish pages. If you're an organization or an individual with a website or social media handles, this box is where you would put that as well. And the very last section is actually signing the application. So you certify that whoever is signing the application is in compliance with various laws, and this is where you would actually sign it. If you're an individual, then you don't really have a title, so that's not absolutely required. But if you're applying on behalf of an organization, then perhaps like the development director would put their title here, or the executive director would put their title here. So that is the full application. So before we move on, are there any questions about the application questions? And I see there have been a bunch of questions in the chat, so thank you, Leah and Jasper, for responding. But anything people want to ask right now? All right. So let us go back to the applicant, to the presentation.
Yeah, and so next we're going to talk about components of successful applications. And Hillary talked about this a lot, and definitely encourage you all to look at the RFP and the weighted review criteria. But one of the first key things is a clear and detailed research question or interest area. So that's the first component of your application. Hillary gave some great examples, and making sure that you're being specific, that you're touching on the who, the where, and explaining that clearly. Compelling contribution to DC history. You're making your case why collecting these oral histories is really key, why DC history needs to include this oral history archive. And also then an explanation as to why oral history is the best format for the project. So Hillary showed you that question. You really need to show, like, why is collecting this life history approach from these narrators that you've selected the best way to explore these questions. You want to have specific ideas or explanations about how you plan to connect with the community that you're going to access if you're not already connected to them. If you are, then you want to talk about that in that section, and especially including narrator recruitment, being able to be specific about who it is you plan to recruit to be narrators. You don't necessarily have to have names at this stage, but being specific about how you're going to go about doing that. The project director's motivation shines through. It's clear through the project director's statement why this project is important to them, and why they're taking this on, and that the other personnel roles are defined. If you have multiple people on your team, it's important to indicate what role they're going to be playing. Are they going to be interviewing? Are they going to be helping you schedule interviews? Things like that. Let's see. Okay, so one key thing is not to propose collecting oral histories that have either already been recorded at DCPL or that cannot go into the archive at DCPL. This is really key. We need to be one of the requirements of this grant is that the interviews collected are archived at the DC Public Library's Dig DC. So you can take a look and review Dig DC to make sure that the interviews that you're planning to collect haven't already been collected for some reason. So yeah, and then Hillary mentioned the shareback session, but just really, really importantly is how detailed you are. I think that our reviewers, as Hillary mentioned, they're community members, they're individuals who may not have any familiarity with your project, and being able to explain to them exactly what it is you're planning to do, why it is you're doing it, why this is so important, all of the components that go into it. I think it's really important to expound as much as you can. And really be detailed in your explanation. So on the flip side, the common application issues, your project scope is too broad, you haven't narrowed it enough. It's not clear why oral history is the best format, why you want to collect oral histories, thinking about the purpose of reaching people and why their stories are important, it's important to make that clear. There may be an unclear description of community involvement or how you're going to go about recruiting your narrators. If you don't have an existing connection to the community and you have no plan to make that connection, that's an issue that comes across a lot and that reviewers will probably score down for. Just generally, if the application looks like it was written in a rush, doesn't contain key details, isn't complete, those are some really common issues. So take your time, get started if you haven't already. So the application review process, I'll go really quickly. So once applications are submitted, our staff does an eligibility review just to make sure that all applicants meet the eligibility requirements that we outline in the RFP. That typically takes a few days. And once we've completed that, then we assign all applications to the community grant reviewers who have volunteered to review our grants. Hillary and I don't make any funding decisions. Our board doesn't make any funding decisions. And so those reviewers take about 3 weeks to go through all of the applications. They score based on the weighted review criteria that Hillary showed you earlier. And then they meet for about 3 hours after 3 weeks of review, they meet for 3 hours to discuss all of the applications. They talk through scores. There's no requirement that a consensus be reached, but those meetings are usually really helpful to help reviewers talk about the different projects and come together to think about how to score certain applications. Once that process is complete, we have our slate of likely grantees. Then the staff will again just do another review to make sure the project that's proposed meets our requirements and that there were no major concerns raised by the reviewers. And then we send that slate on to our board of directors, along with a memo that goes through the whole process that we just described. Again, board members don't select our grantees. They simply vote to affirm that we've followed this public process. And then we expect to send out funding decisions. So this first cycle will close February 18th. The applications are due, and we expect to send out funding decisions by April 15th. And so that's a pretty short timeline. That's about 10 weeks, and we try to get folks notified very quickly. And then once they're notified, we can usually distribute funds within about 2 weeks. So hopefully by May 1st, all the funds have been distributed to all the different grantees. If you're interested in being a reviewer, we strongly, strongly encourage applicants to consider being reviewers. Applicants can review and apply for grants at the same time. You just wouldn't review in the grant program to which you're applying. And it's a really great way to see kind of behind the scenes, get a sense of what makes for successful applications, get exposed to lots of different cool projects, and make good professional connections. If you complete the cycle, then you also receive a $125 honorarium as a thank you for your time. And then lastly, we offer lots of different applicant resources. In addition to this workshop, we have workshops on all of our different grant programs, so we encourage you to look at that. We have virtual office hours. Hillary and I are available. You can sign up there. We have an FAQ, sample application responses, and we also offer draft review. If you want to save your application in the online system and then email us, we can take a look at it. You just need to let us know about 2 weeks before the application deadline. We have at least one more general information session coming up for this first cycle. We've conducted one workshop already. This is the second workshop, and then we will also on Friday have a workshop for our Visions grant if you're interested in that. But we really encourage you to reach out to us. The applicant resources that we offer, I think, are really helpful, and folks who utilize those tend to be more successful.
And that is the full presentation. So apologies for going 8 minutes over. But at this point, are there any final questions? All right. Well, like Leia said at the very end, she and I are always available to answer questions. We can talk more about your projects one-on-one. You will get this recording and the slides probably by like early next week. And yeah, so good luck on the applications. Thank you all for being here today, sticking it out with us. And I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you very much, everyone.